A millionaire bets on his unattractive maid and discovers something on their wedding night. Him astonished before the narrative began. Comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the Montero party. Arthur Montero, the evening's host, was encircled by his wealthy buddies all chatting over champagne and bloated egos. Arthur, with his customary air of supremacy, commanded the room's attention as usual. Thomas Serrano, famous for his strong tone and love of provocation, he approached with a mocking smile and a glass of wine he fixed. He stared at Arthur. Arthur Thomas's voice was full of mischief. You always say money. Everything in the world can be changed with the proper price. Arthur arched an eyebrow. Bored. Money is the most powerful tool. There are no limitations. Thomas inclined his head, seeming to examine the response. It's easy to say, surrounded by individuals who only tell you what you want to hear. Can you show that the gang fell? Quietly fascinated by the challenge, Arthur placed his drink on an adjacent table and cross-armed, stubborn. And how do you expect me to prove anything evident? Thomas drew closer, a mischievous smirk on his lips. I'll bet you $5 million that you can't marry a woman outside our social circle, cannot meet your beauty or international standards, and you must marry her for 3 months, convincing the world of her marriage in changing Thomas's life. The group's attitude changed as laughing, murmurs, and curious stares filled the room. Arthur let out a short, humorless laugh as everyone waited for his response. Thomas married an unsuitable woman for 3 months. Stupid. It doesn't merit an answer. Thomas ignored Arthur's initial refusal and casually looked about. He saw Maria bringing a tray of champagne glasses across the room with her hair tied back. In a neat hairdo and a clean black and white outfit, her stance was proper. Keeping her eyes downcast as she worked, Thomas nodded and laughed at her. Your maid is odd, outside your norm, and perfect for the challenge. Arthur followed Thomas's gaze. You're kidding me, married to a maid. That's absurd even for me. You, why not? Thomas smiled provocatively, if money really does. You're Arthur Montero, so buying everything should be easy. Or are you afraid? Arthur kept his stare while the guests held their breath, mesmerized by the mounting tension. Fixated on that, felt the challenge hit his pride. He knew backing down now would make him look like a coward, which he couldn't allow. Arthur moistened his lips. Finally, he took a sip of his wine and declared with a chilly voice. Smile. In 3 months, I'll prove pro to you. No challenge. Can't conquer, the group murmured and laughed. But Thomas grinned and extended his hand. Thomas, this will be fun. Arthur successfully sealed the agreement, replied mockingly. But make it look real. I want to see her dressed with you at events like a high society lady, and I'll be $5 million richer if you ail. Arthur Thomas, I always open your wallet next. Maria was washing dishes in the morning when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Arthur. Montero in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, staring at her. Mr. She asked Montero nervously if he needed anything. He said, yes, Maria. Stepping closer, I need to discuss a proposition. Maria frowned. Confused proposal. Arthur leaned in slightly, carefully picking his words. He knew to convince Mar he'd need to set the perfect tone. I want you to marry me. Maria's plate fell. You heard me right, crashing into the sink and splashing water everywhere. Arthur spoke calmly as if discussing business. It's a marriage based on convenience. Wife for 3 months and I'll pay you a life-changing sum. Maria laughed nervously. I'm not joking, Maria. His jokes aren't amusing. He placed a check from his pocket on the counter. Enough to fix any financial situation. You've struggled for years, but with this money you can start over. Maria glanced at the check and then at Arthur, knowing it was evident he didn't view her as a person because he was used to dominating everything. A way to accomplish something, she inquired, confused because you're perfect. Arthur responded simply, no one would expect me to marry someone like you. That's why it will work. Arthur's frank honesty made her uneasy. Maria wanted to say no and go, but late payments and family responsibilities prevented her. Heavy on her heart, and if I agree, what happens after the 3 months? Do we divorce? He said no. Questions without ties. You and I return to your lives, but you'll be better off. You began. Maria breathed deeply, knowing what entering this arrangement was like. Selling part of herself, but maybe it was her last chance to change her reality. I accept, she said. Arthur, great. You'll be my wife tomorrow. Maria watched him leave. Kitchen with a heavy heart, she knew she was playing a hazardous game, but for the first time in a while, hope that things would change the next morning started with a new tension at Montero Mansion. The staff whispering in the halls, confused by Arthur's behavior. It was unusual to see him spend so much time home, especially dressed nicely so early. But Maria's day had begun. Like other cleaners, she hid on the side. Garden bending, she grabbed fallen leaves from an old tree. The smell of moist grass mixed with the flowers gave Maria a moment of peace before Arthur's shadow appeared. Interrupted her tranquility, Maria called. She stood up. She hastily wiped her hands on her uniform edge, unaware that she was dirtying her apron. Arthur and she saw a distinct determination and what felt like expecting Mr. Montero, she said, attempting to mask her discomfort. Everything's all set. Well, after an hour, Maria blinked, bewildered, at the registry office already. Yes, we should start soon. Arthur put his hands in his pockets and directed the documents. Already, just sign. Maria's heart raced till the proposal looked far, a ridiculous fantasy she felt she could still reverse. But with marriage close, it all felt real. I need more time, she added nervously. Arthur tilted his head. Head watching her time for what you agreed. Maria and I'm not used to waiting. She wanted to back out, but images of her humble household, her younger brother's worn expressions, and the growing debts held her back. Groaning, she nodded and murmured subtly, Maria was in Arthur's black sedan 1 hour later. Limousine that felt worse than her circumstances, the driver drove silently. She stared out the window, seeing the city rush by while Arthur scribbled messages on his phone. Downtown felt like an other universe, with large skyscrapers, upscale boutiques, and well-dressed people. Arthur suddenly put his phone down after never looking around. Maria got out of the car in front of a modest but grand building. Arthur held the registry office door for her as she hesitantly left. 2 lawyers and a small group of staff who had been told not to ask were waiting. Questions. Maria's stomach churned as she signed the papers with the pen. Her hands trembled, but she kept calm and became Miss in minutes. Montero Arthur shook the registrar's hand and smiled at Maria. Congratulations. We're legally husband and wife. Now it's different, Maria mumbled without looking. Instead of responding, Arthur led her back to the car. Maria sensed something when they arrived at the mansion. Stillness was even heavier. The main hall has new drapes, softer lighting, and a fresh decoration. The atmosphere seemed almost dramatic, like the house was preparing for a big play. Arthur escorted her upstairs and stopped at a door he opened, feeling apprehensive. Beautiful bedroom with a huge bed, velvet drapes, and a closet. He claimed your room will be in Maria's house, perhaps the most important. Obvious thing, Maria entered and examined every detail. It's beautiful, she remarked, unsure of her place. I hope you're happy and remember you're my wife. Crucial that everyone believes it, especially my friends. Maria turned to him, crossing her arms, and Mr. Montero Arthur cocked an eyebrow at her defiance, used to being obeyed. Without question, but Maria didn't seem willing to make things simple. I expect you to play the part elegantly. Clothes, great posture, and no impulsivity. Maria laughed briefly. Arthur grimaced, but didn't answer because he knew she only cared about appearances. Was right, but wouldn't confess it tomorrow morning. A stylist will aid you. Choose proper outfits. Maria felt the weight of it all. She didn't want to accept it, but realized she was stuck in this arrangement. Great. If you desire that, I'll help, but don't expect me to change. Maria, as long as you follow the arrangement, I don't care. Arthur shrugged. Care who you are with, that he exited the room, leaving Maria alone in the huge, chilly expanse she sat on the edge of. Bed seemed small and out of place. Tears threatened, but she fought them back. 3 months, she whispered to herself. Just 3 months outside, Arthur marched down the stairs determinedly, his thoughts already on he couldn't describe it. But Maria unsettled him. She wasn't like him. People in his life, and it disturbed him. The game had started, but neither they were ready for the twist the next morning. Maria was woken by light bangs before she could react, A beautiful woman in a tailored suit entered the room. Her confident movements behind her two workers carried a rack of exquisite outfits. "Good morning, Mrs. Montero," the woman smiled professionally. "My name is Clara, and I was hired by your company. Husband to help you dress for upcoming events," still sitting on the bed. Maria blinked, confused. "Yes, Mr. Clara nodded and started arranging the outfits. Montero placed a full order since he believes looks is important, especially for your job. "Outfit for you," Maria scoffed gently. "Is this necessary?" Clara stopped sorting the garments to stare at Maria without losing her control. Maria wanted to dispute, but he wanted respect, ma'am, and I advise you take advantage. Practicality. Good, let's finish," Clara grinned positively. "Fantastic option." Maria was fitted and styled in a couple hours. Maria saw that the assistants discussed fabrics and styles like she was a doll. Despite feeling uncomfortable, the pricey outfits couldn't cover who she was, and she knew no outfit could. Her fit into this environment. Arthur was waiting in the main hall in a leather chair when she descended the stairs. Armchair, he looked up from the iPad and silently observed her. "Not bad," he said. Indifference. It irritated her. "Thanks," Maria answered, crossing. Arthur stood up and fixed his tie, disregarding her sarcasm. "At dinner tonight with my friends, you must be prepared." Ria narrowed her brows. "When were you going to inform me about this?" he asked. "Evident," Maria groaned. "I'm tired of that attitude. But don't expect me to fake someone else." Arthur smiled slightly. "As long as, please don't disgrace me." Dinner was at a high-end restaurant noted for its exclusivity, clients, and lavish decor. When Arthur and Maria arrived, everyone stared at them, while he strode confidently with Maria at his side. Ignoring the curious looks at the table, Thomas was waiting with two other BET pals when Maria sat down. Thomas provided a sarcastically smiling. He said, "This is Mrs. Montero." Maria flushed at ridicule, but kept her cool. Thomas laughed. "Arthur, you outdid yourself this time." Arthur glared at Thomas but said nothing, since he knew reacting would make his pals enjoy it more. Maria, she wouldn't allow Thomas get away with it. And you, Thomas, normally judge others' lives. Therefore, the question surprised them. Guard Thomas choked on his wine, while the others laughed quietly. Arthur stared at Maria, shocked but didn't say anything. Intercede. Her attitude was so strong and courageous that he couldn't ignore it. Hostile surroundings. Dinner continued with shallow conversations, but Maria could see Arthur's eyes were on her every move and word. Pals, she felt like she was on display but didn't show it. When they exited the restaurant, Maria let relief as she entered the car. She stated that was interesting. Arthur leaned forward and watched her through the window. "You handled it admirably." Maria turned to him, shocked by the comment. Apparently, Arthur delivered a half-smiling, but saying nothing. He knew he had underestimated Maria, which disturbed him for days. Maria adjusted to the mansion schedule, although she still felt out of place among the servants. Arthur observed her suspiciously and admired her humility and determination. He was used to managing every aspect of his life. But Maria was a mystery. Wondered why he heard light footfall one night while studying documents in his workplace. Maria was holding a cup of tea at the entrance. "You seem like you need a break," she said, going in. Without authorization, Arthur arched an eyebrow at her confidence. "And you think you can tell me?" Maria shrugged and placed the cup on the desk. "It doesn't harm to try." After some hesitation, Arthur took the cup and inhaled the fresh herb smell. Maria sat in one of the office seats, looking at the paperwork on the desk. "Someone has to work hard," he said. Curtly, Maria smiled gently. "Arthur, rest sometimes." Her simplicity unsettled him, as if she reminded him of, "You're unusual," he said without thinking. Maria tilted her head in amazement. Arthur shook his head, trying to dismiss it. Maria laughed gently. "I'll take that as a compliment." She stood. Ready to depart, she gazed at him one final time and said goodnight. Arthur said goodnight, Maria, without looking away as the door closed and lay back in his chair. Still holding the teacup for the first time in a while, he felt strangely at ease, but he couldn't explain why. Arthur called Maria to the rear garden the next morning to find a table beneath. The Clara was under the shadow of a great oak tree with books, cutlery, crystal glasses, and a small note. The lovely gray-haired Maria stylist smiled formally beside her. Who emanated authority, Maria narrowed her eyes as she approached Arthur, looked at her impassively. Tone Maria, this is Aesir, pointing to the gray-haired woman. As an etiquette and manners expert, she'll teach you daily for the following 3 weeks to act like your new job. Rhea frowned etiquette lessons. Arthur crossed his arms and looked at her, as if to say, daring her to refuse requires knowing how to behave at my events. We can't take chances, Maria. No matter what, nothing is more important than excellent for impressing people, right? He said. Disregarding the sarcasm, let tune begin. Maria felt she couldn't leave this arrangement away, but she wouldn't make things easy for Arthur. She sat at the table with her arms crossed. Right teach me perfection, then the early classes tested their patience. Esther, with her excellent posture and nearly unshakable serenity, showed how to hold and use a wine glass. Maria, however, made a point of Maria intentionally makes little blunders to see Arthur's reaction. As Maria dropped a fork for the third time, Esther sighed. You need to focus. Trying, Maria smiled mischievously. Arthur watched everything. Distance narrowed his eyes, Maria. This is required for you, since I'm fine. Maria stared at him. Look, contesting, it's vital for both of us, Arthur replied. I don't bet to lose. Maria laughed but grabbed up. Though defiant, she wanted to show she could learn not to please Arthur, but to Maria proved he couldn't define her as time went on. She noticed minor changes in her routine, and the etiquette lectures grew less bothersome as she mastered them. Her relationship with Arthur was tense one evening. While meal, Arthur gazed at Maria as she ate, eager to catch her making a mistake, placed her fork and knife exactly on her plate and smiled at him. Are you satisfied? She said, defiant. Arthur half smiled. I'll agree you're improving. Well, I'm a committed student, Maria answered. Despite the taunting, something felt different between them that night. Arthur saw Maria as more than her appearance, or challenge attitude for the first time. After realizing Maria was stronger and sharper than he thought, Arthur took her to her first Clarice Belmont. Maria dressed for a charity luncheon sponsored by one of his business colleagues. Arthur felt every attention was on her when Clara entered in a beautiful blue gown. Apprehensive, she kept her head up. Clarice, a powerful woman, Arthur. Dear, who is this wonderful lady? This is my wife, Maria. Arthur smiled respectfully. With a fake smile, Clarice furrowed her eyebrows in surprise, but soon concealed her reaction with a kind handshake. Nice to meet you, Maria. Arthur never mentioned being married. Maria, realizing that Clarice was being kind, smiled sweetly. The joy is mine. During brunch, Maria noticed guests looking her curiously, plainly attempting to figure out how she got Arthur, but instead of feeling guilty, terrified, she used it as inspiration. Let's have fun with comment-only readers. Milkshake in the comments. Only those who read this far will understand. When Clarice asked, Maria said, I think helping others shouldn't be limited to events like this. It's something we can all do daily, even in small ways. Her remarks surprised everyone. Arthur paused before intervening to see the guests seem genuinely impressed and interesting. Viewpoint. Clarice raised her champagne glass. Arthur, your wife seems to have much to teach us. Maria sensed pride and relief. For the first time, she seemed to have survived in that foreign environment. Arthur paused in the corridor of the mansion and told Maria, you were impressive today. Maria arched an eyebrow at the comment. Is it a compliment? Yep, he added with a hint of a smile. You win people over. You're different from them. Maria laughed, crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur gazed at her like he saw something new. Why are they so interested in you? Rhea looked away, uneasy at his tone. Maria, I did what I thought was right. Keep it up, he added before leaving. Corridor, seeing him disappear upstairs for the first time, she began to understand Arthur. Despite his coldness and contempt, he hid something from everyone, even himself, as weeks went by. By forcing Maria and Arthur to live together, revealed hidden aspects of both. Despite continual taunting power struggles between them, Arthur saw Maria look to wear an invisible burden one night. She sat alone on a stone bench in the mansion's garden, holding a little object. Notebooks she leafed through absent-mindedly. Sad face, Arthur said, declaring his presence. Maria startled, closing the notebook. I couldn't sleep either, he replied, walking. What are you reading? It's mine, she said.
Asleep.
Arthur felt her uneasiness and dropped the issue. But his curiosity was piqued. He wanted to know what was important about the notepad. The next day, while Maria helped in the kitchen, Arthur sat in his office, thinking about the reports. Reading, he saw her in the garden for some reason. Small notebook attracted him more than he wanted to confess after lunch. While Maria was busy downstairs, Arthur went to her room, hesitated before opening the door, but gave in. A vase of wilting flowers and the notebook were his dresser curiosities. Snatched it up and carefully turned the pages. He found notes and sketches like a diary. Some pages had doodles of flowers and landscapes, while others had text and thoughts. He noticed a depiction of two tiny children holding hands with a woman below. Note: I pledged to defend them at all costs. Arthur scowled. Who were? He didn't know Maria had relatives or children, so Arthur was uneasy over supper. He watched Maria intently to figure out why she was staring at him, then inquired. He ignored her query and inquired if she had siblings. Maria froze but quickly recovered. Why do you ask? He said. Nada. Maria looked uncomfortable. I have two younger brothers. I hope they're okay. You don't talk to them. Maria sighed, setting her fork down. Our last contact was years ago. Kids reside with an aunt in another place. Arthur observed that she seemed bitter, but he knew there was more to the story. Knew he needed patience to receive answers a few days later. While Maria was with Clara, Arthur called his trusty helper Marcos for a talk. I want you to learn everything you can about Maria. He handed him a photo. Mr. Montero. Marcos inquired, interested family, past anything she may be hiding. Arthur avoided looking at his assistant, feeling guilty for his actions. The next morning, Marcos sent Arthur a comprehensive Maria dossier, which he reviewed. Stillness filling the weight of each page. Maria raised her two children in a modest area. Younger brothers, her parents perished in a vehicle accident when she was 17, leaving her alone. She supported the children with two jobs for a few years, but lost custody because Arthur's chest tightened as he pictured Maria confronting all that alone. He never considered that she would have experienced such trials. Among the documents was an old photo of Maria and her brothers. She looked so young and hopeful cuddling the kids that night. Arthur discovered Maria seated on the same bench in the garden again. He approached her more gently and sat by her. I need to ask you something, he said. Immediately, Maria gazed at him exhaustedly. What is it now? Why have you never? The question astonished Maria, who pursed her lips. That may not be your concern, he said softly,
Asleep.
but I read about it. I needed to read Arthur's perspective. Maria's eyes widened. Know who you are, Maria, and now I do. She got up quickly, crossing her arms. Do you think you can invade my... He said, Arthur, I'm not playing, Maria. Standing too, I wanted to know why you're so guarded and closed off. And now I know you fought alone. You don't know. Maria shook her head, tears threatening to flow. Everything about me. I know you lost everything, he said firmly, and never gave up. That's more than I can say. About most individuals I know. Maria stared at the ground silently. Arthur added, I can't change what happened, but at least while you're here, you're not. The first time Maria heard his sincerity, she was astonished. Time she saw something genuine in Arthur that changed her mind. She thanked him before returning to the mansion. Arthur stayed there for a while. While looking at the starry sky for the first time in years, he thought he could finally appreciate its importance. People around him said the night was cold and the Mono mansion quieter than normal. Maria watched the window from her room. Despite being surrounded by luxury, she felt lonelier than ever. Her discussion with Arthur. She heard a faint knock at the door as she turned out the lights, thinking about her past. She was confused and opened it to see Arthur with an illegible message. Sorry to trouble you so late, he said nervously, but I need to chat. Maria raised an eyebrow. Arthur never hesitated, which made her wonder about us. In this position, he gestured vaguely. She let him in. Arthur paced the room, trying to gather his thoughts, then turned to her. I know I pressured you into this arrangement, he said, his voice lowering. Been kind. Maria turned her head, astonished by his humility. Apology, Arthur smiled crookedly. Maybe I'm bad at this. She crossed her arms and watched him curiously. Why are you saying this now? You deserve more than I've offered, he admitted, staring squarely at her. Maria remained silent for a time, processing his comments. It was the first time Arthur sounded vulnerable. I never asked for anything, Arthur, she whispered. I agreed to your game terms. He responded soon, although you deserve respect, which I failed to give you. His honesty scared me. Though she wasn't ready to forgive him, Maria's anger and resentment began to dissipate. She remarked, respect is a good start, and Arthur nodded, relieved. Can I stay? She replied with humor. If you promise not to criticize my simple furniture, you can. With a sincere smile, they sat on the floor and shared the night. A bottle of wine Maria stashed in a drawer. They talked naturally, surprising them both. Arthur, he rarely discussed his childhood and the challenges of growing up. Growing up in an affluent family where emotions were weaknesses and performance counted. My mother often remarked love was a diversion, he added, swirling his wine glass. She claimed relationships are like business dealings. You anticipate a return? Maria laughed gently. That explains a don't condemn me too quickly, he murmured tiredly. I know I'm a product of this atmosphere, but sometimes I wonder how things could have been different. Maria watched him for a while, moment trying to imagine what was beyond that hard facade. Arthur can change, I guess. I think anyone can change if they want to, she said with conviction. Arthur's eyes. How would you change if you could? Maria was silent. Sometimes I wish I'd been stronger. Maybe my brothers would still be with me if I had fought harder. Maria, you did everything you could, he continued. Don't blame yourself. That's easy for you to say, she said, looking down. Arthur leaned forward, maintaining her eyes. Strongest person I know, and if no one's told you that before, Maria felt tears coming. She smiled lightly, thank you, instead of letting her eyes droop. Arthur's connection changed subtly afterward. Though they still joked, they now understood and respected each other. Maria was in the garden tending to flowers one afternoon when Arthur relaxedly approached. Maria was astonished to hear I needed help with something. You want me to attend an important meeting tonight? Maria smiled. I had a business meeting with you. Arthur nodded. You're my wife, thought it was to trick your friends? Maybe, he remarked with a smile. But your perspective could be different. Be valuable. She paused, then nodded. Yes, do not expect me to sit silently like an accessory. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, he answered. They arrived at the conference that evening with a twinkle in his eye, and Maria felt all overwhelmed again. She kept her head high with Arthur's presence by her side when one looked at her. Maria surprised everyone by speaking up with all the investors about a new project's ethics. Due respect, she began. I don't think profit and ethics have to be mutually exclusive. Financial achievement without compromising core beliefs. The room went silent and all eyes were on her. Arthur, standing next to her, smiled proudly. The meeting leader, an elderly man in a perfect suit, nodded. Slow, interesting viewpoint, Mrs. Montero. I'd like to hear more. Arthur saw Maria again and marveled at how different she was from everyone he had known. The mansion. Maria, fatigued yet happy, took off her shoes and fell on the living room sofa. Arthur, and shortly after, hands in pockets, he studied her before speaking. You were amazing. Good night, thank you, she replied tiredly. I'm not just saying that to flatter you. I think you have something special. Maria glanced at him, astonished by his honesty. Arthur laughed next to Ria. Maybe you're changing me. Ria smiled briefly, didn't answer, but she sensed something was changing between them, but wasn't sure what. Week flew by, and Arthur decided to introduce Maria to the most exclusive social group. Prestigious annual elite ball, attended by the nation's most influential. Maria didn't share his enthusiasm when Arthur first mentioned the occasion. She nearly dropped her coffee cup. A ball? Her eyebrows lifted. It's a big event, Arthur calmly said. Maria huffed, crossing her arms. Arthur, I can hardly handle formal dinners. Do you think I'll feel comfortable in a judgment-filled place? Detail about me, he shrank. You've shown you can handle challenging situations. Circumstances won't be as horrible as you imagine. Maria narrowed her gaze. I'm going to be a target in there, and you know it. Arthur groaned, massaging his belly. Temple, they'll judge you, but you're not there to please them. So why bother? She asked, because it's important to me. Arthur said truly. Maria paused, recognizing that Arthur asked for the first time, without pressing or demanding. Finally, I'll answer if somebody insults me, Arthur smiled. That's all I expect. You on ball day. Clara and her team arrived early to prepare Maria. Fabrics, jewels, and makeup artists filled the mansion, creating an improvised Adele. Maria was uncomfortable as the team altered her long silver outfit. Her reflection was shimmering, and she barely recognized the lady staring back at her. Gorgeous, Clara murmured, adjusting the dress hem. Maria smiled tentatively. It doesn't feel like me. Clara softly took her hands. You may be wearing anything else. You don't forget that. Maria nodded, inhaling deeply. Arthur was waiting when she descended the stairs, so she needed all her confidence. In a flawless tuxedo, he halted when he saw her in the vast entry hall. His eyes examining every detail, he murmured, You look stunning. Honest and formal. Maria flushed, looking away. Thank you, don't look too awful yourself. Arthur extended his arm, and she felt like she was entering uncharted territory. The ballroom was stunning, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the lofty ceiling. Ceiling lights illuminate exotic floral and gold candelabra tables. Maria and Arthur approached as the orchestra played a beautiful melody. All eyes were on them. There were whispers, glances, and muffled giggles. Maria's stomach twisted, but she kept her head up, recalling Arthur's instruction. They're all staring at me, muttered, bending closer. Arthur said quietly, They've got nothing else to do. Maria smiled faintly at his support. Arthur led Maria from group to group, introducing her as his wife. One woman, Vanessa, was arrogant, while others were courteous but remote. Tall and blonde, Belmont exuded beauty. Vanessa approached Arthur with a lovely smile, disregarding Maria. Arthur, it's great to see. Vanessa delicately touched his arm and asked who this distinguished. Maria narrowed her brows, but Arthur interrupted her. Vanessa, this is my wife. She raised her eyebrows as if she had heard something odd, but she swiftly covered it with a courteous handshake. Good to meet you, Maria. My pleasure, Maria replied. Composed, Vanessa tilted her head, assessing Maria like a predator assessing its prey. This world requires guts, and Maria smiled sweetly but looked worried. Hey, thanks for the tip. I think it's hard for overreachers. When the music changed to a waltz, Vanessa recoiled slightly with unease. Arthur laughed, extending his hand to Maria. Will we dance? Maria hesitated. The room, he smiled but replied. I'm not good at this either. She took his hand and danced to the center of the ballroom, Maria realizing, despite everything, she felt remarkably comfortable with Arthur. You're doing great, he added. Her across the floor, maybe because you're not stomping on my feet. Arthur laughed, and as Maria dozed later that night, it felt like they were in a planet apart from the judgmental stares. Maria was approached by Arthur's friend Thomas, who smiled ironically and asked how she was enjoying the table. Your perfect wife role. Maria crossed her arms and met his eyes. Thank you, Tom. Thomas chuckled, but it was cruel. You're doing better than I expected, but how long will it persist? Maria felt angry but kept her cool. Thomas, what are you attempting to prove me? He said, feigning ignorance. I find it amazing how Arthur found someone so unorthodox before Maria. Answer. Arthur placed a hard hand on Thomas's shoulder. That's enough, Thomas shrugged. Surrendering. Relax, Arthur, having enjoyment. Arthur retained his stern gaze. Once Thomas backed off, then he apologized to Maria and said no. Need to apologize, she said. I can manage people like him. Arthur admired her resolve. Maria was relieved as they left the ball. Car. When city lights went by the window, she said, Arthur, why did you bring me here? Because I wanted people to see who you are. He said without hesitation. Maria smiled but was silent. First time she felt Arthur viewed her as more than a pawn. Days after the ball changed the Montero mansion's atmosphere. Maria and Arthur began to understand each other. They connected in unexpected ways, but Maria began to act out, causing stress. Drop her guard.
Дорожки прямо.
Arthur
Да-да.
appeared increasingly worried by something he wouldn't say. Maria noticed it in tiny signals the evenings he worked late. The distant expression during dinners and talks occasionally ended abruptly when personal topics arose one morning. She entered the library looking for a book and saw Arthur at the desk staring at a photo frame. Hands, he didn't notice her till she cleared her throat. Okay, she asked, noting his moroseness. Expression, Arthur hastily put the frame back on the desk and attempted to hide his emotions. Just memories from the Maria saw the snapshot featured a younger pair as she approached. The photo showed Arthur's parents next to a boy she thought was Arthur as a child. The grins contrasted. With his strained expression, they appear glad, Maria whispered Arthur. Moaned, running his hand over his hair. They seem joyful, but the truth is rarely so simple. Picture Maria in the chair across from him, wants to discuss it. Arthur hesitant to express sentiments or vulnerabilities, but Maria-inspired trust father was difficult, he said in a low voice. And he thought the only way to success was total control over people, business, and family. My mother never questioned him. Maria sensed his animosity. And you grew up. Arthur nodded, expecting me to follow. To emulate him, and I did for a long period. I believed him that only the strongest survive in the world. But what about your mother? She thought Arthur looked aside as if the answer weighed on him. She always put family first, but in Maria calmly processed her father's requests without speaking up for us. She saw Arthur, the man behind the icy confident mask, for the first time in his words. Possibly why you're so reserved, she said gently. Arthur laughed dryly. Reserved is a generous term. I become distrustful because it's easy. Maria leaned forward, locking. You don't have to live like that, Arthur. Different. He gazed at her as if trying to believe her. But before he could answer, the mansion's doorbell rang through the halls urgently, as if someone was outside. Marcos, Arthur's assistant, was at the entryway when Arthur and Maria arrived. Already examining the security monitor, Thomas Marcos stated with a hint of Arthur grimaced, wondering what Thomas wanted when the door opened. He was arrogant as usual, but he appeared more aggressive, almost furious. I'm listening, Arthur said, crossing his arms. We need to talk. Thomas said, ignoring Maria, stared at Maria and rolled his eyes privately. Anything you say can be said to her, Arthur remarked firmly. So now she's your confidant? Thomas laughed sarcastically. Given the stakes, Maria scowled. Growing uncomfortable, Arthur shot a cold glance at Thomas. Say what you came here to say. Thomas placed a folder from his jacket on the your bet went too far. Maria froze. Bet what bet? Arthur closed his eyes as if the situation were crushing him. He knew the truth would come out, but not so fast. Thomas became harsh. Arthur bet us that he could marry you, a woman outside his sphere, and keep her. The 3 months you spent with him were a game to him. The quiet was awful. Maria stared at Arthur. Arthur, she waited for him to deny it, to say Thomas was lying, but he didn't. Inquired, her voice breaking. Maria. Arthur started to answer, but his throat choked on words. She moved back, feeling like, though the ground beneath her had evaporated, so every word and action was a lie. It's not that simple. Maria laughed furiously, but she wasn't laughing for fun. You screwed with my mind. Life, Arthur, you used me for a ridiculous bet, Maria. Listen. Getting closer, no, she shouted, leaving. I don't want to hear more. Your cold, greedy, and uncaring nature is precisely what I expected when I met you. Thomas, pleased with his pandemonium, smiled condescendingly. Maria breathed deeply as he went, leaving Maria and Arthur alone. Keeping quiet, I can't stay here, Arthur. Maria, not after this. I was wrong. But I really care about you, she said, glanced at him with tears in her eyes. If you cared, you would not have done this without a reaction. Maria went upstairs to pack, while Arthur stayed in the room, defeated for the first time. When he realized he'd lost something priceless, Maria departed the mansion that night, rejecting Arthur's offer. Offered to drive her, she didn't know where she was heading, but decided to go because his deception hurt too much. Deep to ignore as the rideshare car carried her away, Maria peered at the city lights, trying to find her way back. Arthur remained alone in his study, peering into vacancy. Know he committed the worst mistake of his life and must face it. Consequences. Maria stayed in a tiny boarding house on the Mono Mansion for the following weeks. Outskirts of the city, she rented a modest room with some of Arthur's money and looked for work. Maria had to deal through his betrayal, which was difficult. Arthur felt her absence in the mansion, which was previously full of life. Months Maria had been there felt cold and dead. He spent his night alone in his office staring at the one. Afternoon, Marcos, Arthur's assistant, entered the office with a packet in the contract that started it. Sheet of paper, Mr. Montero remarked nervously. I found Mrs. Maria. Arthur looked up astonished. He requested Marcos to find her. He asked softly, unsure if she would let him approach her again. Intended, she's a downtown cafe waitress, Marcos answered. Arthur paused, thinking about how he needed to see her, but couldn't just show up. Finally, get the automobile ready, he said. Maria heard the bell above the door while cleaning down a table at the little cafe where she started working. She didn't notice customers until she heard a familiar sound. Maria turned and saw Arthur in a flawless suit, but Arthur seemed like she had never seen him before. She remarked, shocked. Wary of what you were doing, he stepped forward with respect. I needed to talk to you. There's nothing to discuss, she said. Back to the table she was scrubbing. Give me 5 minutes, he replied. Maria stopped and glanced at him. His posture was more humble versus her better judgment. She nodded 5 minutes, gesturing to an unoccupied table. I'm the last person you want to see, Arthur said, sitting while Maria stood with arms crossed. Softly, I know what I did was awful, so why are you here? She asked sternly. Deserve more than I gave you, he added, and I'll make amends if you let me. Maria laughed bitterly. Making things right, Arthur. You changed my life, a game you used me to fuel your ego. How would you rectify that? Arthur breathed deeply and stroked his hair. I donated every penny from the BET. Any of it related to us? Maria stared at him, shocked. You did, yes, but I realize it doesn't erase what I did to you. I regret it sincerely, she was. She questioned Arthur. What do you want from me now? I want a chance to prove I can be different, he replied honestly. Not for fun, but because he cared about Maria. Heart tightened. She wanted to believe him, but was afraid of being harmed. I need time, she said nervously. Arthur nodded in agreement. I'll wait as long as it takes. The weeks that followed brought substantial changes to both their lives. Arthur joined social projects, as Maria said. The palatial chats led him to visit underprivileged neighborhoods. Mar passed while Maria worked, hearing to stories of people with similar challenges. She tried to restructure her life at the cafe, but Arthur wouldn't leave. His cafe remarks haunted her, and she wondered if he had changed while shopping. Maria met Clara, her mansion stylist, at the market. What a surprise! Maria prepared the cafe tables in the morning, reflecting on how her life had altered since leaving the Montero mansion 3 months later. She still felt incomplete after rebuilding part of her routine when she heard the doorbell and saw Arthur standing there clothed simply with a look she had never seen before. Arthur, she asked, astonished, what are you doing here? Nervous and hopeful. He hesitated before starting. I needed to see you, Maria. I had to say something I couldn't keep within anymore. She crossed her arms to preserve her emotional distance. I guess we've talked everything. Maybe, he responded, staring at her. But I could not let you leave my life without trying again and telling you how much you changed me. Maria took deep breath. She placed the cloth on the counter. And what do you want from me now, Arthur? I never want another chance to prove you can win at anything, he added hastily. To hurt you again, Maria. I want you to know that the man you met during that idiotic contract is gone. That life is about more than power and money. I want to be a guy worthy of... Maria's heart raced, but she held her cool. His words were real, but betrayal hadn't healed, have you? Truly changed Arthur, she whispered. I'm trying, Maria, he said firmly, and all I want is a chance to demonstrate you with actions. Maria stayed silent, looking. Finally, she stated change and forgiveness. Take time, Arthur, I know, he replied with a slight smile, and I'll wait whatever it takes. The weeks that followed were Arthur showed Maria his humanitarian efforts while she was there. asked him to visit her world at the cafe. Maria noticed that her current partner was different from the one she met months earlier. Maria accepted Arthur's invitation to a charity event in a disadvantaged community where he worked. Observe his behavior while Arthur discussed the changes in various settings during the event. Community. He grinned at Maria in the audience after his address. He offered his hand. Come with me, I'll show you. Something Arthur took her back to the mansion, specifically to the garden where so many crucial conversations had taken place. It was remodeled and the garden was lit by rows of lights dangling from the trees and a flower petal walkway to a white and red rose arch. A modest table with 2 chairs, a bottle of wine, and 2 glasses waited under the arch. The scene left Maria dumbfounded Arthur. What is this? When they reached the arch, Arthur held Maria's hands and guided her down the walk. You changed my life in ways I never anticipated. I was an empty guy preoccupied with control, achievement, but you taught me what matters most. People connections, love. Maria cried, but let him continue. I know our beginning was incorrect, but I can offer you a better future if you let me. Arthur let go of her hands and retrieved a little velvet box from his pocket, knelt, and looked at it. She looked the most vulnerable Maria had ever seen. Maria, he started. I want you as my wife because I love you, not because of a contract or bet. Will you marry me for real? I want to establish a life with you based on respect, trust, and love. When Maria covered her mouth with her hands, tears rolled down her face, and her heart aches, past and optimism for the future. But she sensed true regret in Arthur. Love, yes, Arthur, she said nervously. I accept. Arthur's expression lighted up. He stepped up and pulled her into a tight embrace as he slid the ring on her finger with a ranch smile. The event took place under the lights and floral arch as if the world had disappeared. 2 months later, in the same garden, the scene was even more. Maria chose a white dress with fresh flowers and candles to create a lovely ambience. Beautiful embroidery, her hair in a bun, with little white flowers. Arthur, in a classic outfit, a black suit, stood at the altar, his eyes filled with emotion as Maria walked down the aisle. Promise of a new beginning, guests, volunteers, and grown significant in both their lives, sat in silence as their genuine union finally happened. Arthur claimed Maria is the best while holding her hands during the vows. Single thing that has happened to me, I pledge to love, respect, and stand by your side. Thanks for letting me become a better man through tears, good or bad. In her eyes, Maria said, Arthur, you've showed me that people change. True love takes guts, and I'll always support you as we establish our relationship. Life together as the officiant declared them husband and wife. They kissed as the gathering roared in joy. The reception was packed with music, laughter, and dancing. Arthur and Maria, hand in hand, treasured every minute knowing they had overcome the past and could build a future together. Do you think Maria's forgiveness and marriage to Arthur were right? Comment below and rate this story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow our articles and see more moving stories by end screen. Click here.